Welcome back to The Mark Covered House, Chapter 22. This is the book about William Knowlin's adventures as a youth in Michigan, in the backwoods of Michigan. Chapter 22, The Bear Hunt of 1842. One day in winter, my brother-in-law, Reuben Crandall, and myself started to go hunting deer, as we supposed. We went south across the windfall and started a flock of deer, and we're following them. We had a good tracking snow and thought it was a good day for hunting. We followed the deer across from Reed Creek and saw a little ahead of us quite a path. It appeared as though a herd of ponies had passed along there. Then there were plenty of French ponies running in the woods. When we came up to the trail or path, we saw they were made in the snow. We discovered that it was 4 bears which had made the path. They had passed along a little time before, for their tracks were fresh and new. There seemed to be a grand chance for us, and we started after them. We either walked very fast or ran, sometimes as fast as we could stand to run, and in this way we followed them several miles and expected to see them every minute. We were going a little slower when I looked one side of us, and there was an Indian on a trot, going in the same direction that we were. I told Crandall that he had seen our tracks and knew that we were after the bears, and that he was trying to cut us off and get the bears away from us. Just then I saw the bears, drew up my rifle, and shot at one as he was standing on an old log. The Indian then turned and ran up to the bear tracks to see probably if I'd killed one. I told Crandall to go on with him and not let him get the start of us, and I would load my rifle as quickly as possible and follow. Being in a hurry, I did not place my bullet right on the patch, and in the muzzle of the rifle, it bothered me in getting down. When it was loaded, I broke for them. I could just see Randall putting in the best he could to try to make 2:40 time. But he was alone, and the Indian had left him. Then there might have been seen some long steps and tall running done by me in those woods, if anyone had been there to witness it, for about 80 rods, when I came up with Crandall and I asked him where the Indian was, and he said, "Yonder, he goes almost out of sight." I could see what he let him get ahead for. He said that he could not keep up with them, and that he had told him 2 or 3 times to stop and wait for me, but he would not pay the least attention to what he said. I told him to keep on the tracks as fast as he could, and I would try to stop the Indian. I saw that the 4 bear tracks were all together yet, and Crandall said that I didn't hit one when I shot. I thought it was singular, and that perhaps my bullet had struck a bush or a twig, glanced off, and saved Mr. Bruin's hide. Now it looked as though the Indian was going to get our bears away from us, sure enough, and now for a chase that was more excitable than is often seen in the woods. The Indian was on a good lope after the bears, and I on a good run after him. I had the advantage of the Indian, and the bears would run crooked. Sometimes they would run on a large log and follow it its whole length right in another direction from the way they had been going. The Indian had to follow their tracks, and I followed him by sight and cut off the crooks as much as I could, and in this way I ran at least a half a mile after leaving Crandall, and was cutting off and gaining on the Indian fast, and had got near enough to halloo at him and told him to stop, but I thought that would do no good, and that it was necessary for me to overtake him. I was bound to stop him. I had got up to within 15 rods, and as good luck would have it, the bears turned from an easterly course around to the northwest. The Indian turned also, and I struck him across the elbow and came to the tracks ahead of him. I stood facing him when he came up and informed him that the bears were ours, and I told him that he should not follow them another step and wait right where he was until the other man came up. I am sure the Indian thought that the white man had outrun him, and maybe he did not think how it was done. He stood there perfectly still, and I guard over him. I thought he looked ugly and mad, and he would hardly say a word. In 2 or 3 minutes, Crandall came up, puffing and blowing like a porpoise. The sweat was running off of him in profusion, and while wiping it from his brow with his hands, he said to the Indian, "You wouldn't stop when I told you to. If I had got a good sight of you, I would have shot you." Of course, Crandall only said this because he wanted to scare the Indian, as he had no thought of shooting or hurting him in the least. We started slowly off on the bear tracks and left the Indian standing and looking at us. I told Crandall I thought the Indian was scared and very mad at us for his threatening to shoot him and my stopping him, that if he got us both in the range, it might be possible he would shoot us. I told him to walk at least a rod one side of me so as to not get both in range of his rifle, and I thought he would not dare to disturb us. As we walked away, I would once in a while turn an eye over my shoulder and look back to see the Indian. He stood there like a statue until we were out of sight. I never saw the Indian again. As soon as we were fairly out of sight of him, we walked fast and finally tried running, some of the time as long as we could stand it. One of the bears was large. Another was about a common size, and 2 were small. The small ones followed behind. They were a fine sight passing through the woods, but they led us a wild chase, and late in the afternoon they crossed Reed Creek going north, partly in the direction of Father's house. Crandall said, "Now I know where we are. I can follow up the creek until I get to Reed's house and then take the path home. I am so tired I can't follow the bears another step." So he sat down to rest. And I told him to come on. It was necessary for us to have 2 or 3 of those bears, and I thought if we could kill one of the larger ones, the smaller ones would be likely to hang around until we could shoot them. But I couldn't get him to go another step. He said he was going home, and I told him that I was going to follow the bears. I went after them as fast as was possible, and after a while came in plain sight of them. The large one was standing with his 4 feet upon the log, broadside to me, looking back at me. I thought Crandall would see how much he missed it leaving me. I drew up my rifle and fired. Ping went the rifle ball, and it made the woods ring, but went away from the bears. I expected to see the bear drop, or at least roll and tumble. I loaded my rifle and went up to where Mr. Bruin had stood, and I looked to see if I had not cut off some of his hair, but could see no signs of having touched him with the bullet. I followed along a little ways and made up my mind that I had not hit him. I thought it strange. It was a fair broadside shot, not more than 20 or 25 rods off, and what the reason was I had missed him I couldn't tell. I followed them on, very much discouraged and miserably tired. After a little, they were making almost straight for Father's clearing. I followed them into the windfall within half a mile of home. It was then about sundown, and as their tracks turned off, I thought I would leave following them until the next morning, and would then start after them again. As I came in sight of our clearing, I thought, as usual, that I would fire off my rifle at a mark, which was on the side of a tree about 10 rods off. I drew it up and shot. My parents knew by the report and the sharp song of my rifle that I was coming, and it was my parting salute to the forest. As the sound of it penetrated the lonely gloom and died away in the darkness of the woods, I looked at the mark on the tree to see where my bullet had struck. I shot nearly a foot right over it. Then I looked at the sight of my rifle and found that the back sight had been raised clear up. Strange to say, I had not noticed it before. No doubt it was done by one of my little sisters or John S. They must have taken it down and been fooling with it on the sly, and then I knew the reason for my bad luck. I think a little more tired and discouraged hunter than I was never crawled out of the woods. With my hitherto trusty companion, I had met with signal defeat. I had carried it hundreds of miles on my shoulders and was not afraid with it to face anything in the woods, day or night, but this time it failed me, and the bears escaped. The report of my rifle that evening seemed changed, as if the very sound told of my bad luck. I made up my mind as I went into the house that the next morning we would raise as many men and dogs as there were bears and try them again. Of course, I was too tired to notify anyone that night myself, so John S. went down to Mr. Purdy's. I know he had a large dog, which he called Watch, that was not afraid to tackle anything that ran in the woods on 4 legs. And I told J.S. to tell Mr. Purdy that I had been following a pack of bears and that I wanted him to come early the next morning and be sure and bring his dog to go with me after them. We had a good dog, and I sent Crandall word to be ready with his dog, and James Wilson volunteered to go with us and take his dog. They were to be on hand at daylight in the morning. After we got together, ready to start after the bears, I told them that I thought the dogs would at least tree the small bears. We all started for the bear tracks, and we took my back tracks. When we got to the tree, I showed them the shot that I had made the night before and told them the reason I was not able to take one or more of those bears by the heels the day before. And then I might have examined them at my leisure. We followed my tracks until we found where I left the bear tracks, and then we followed them. I supposed they were tired, so they would lay down and rest, and probably in the windfall, but they were too badly scared for that. They seemed to have traveled all night, and we followed them across the north part of the town of Taylor, through the oak openings into what we called the West Woods, and into the town of Romulus. They had given us a wide range before we came up to them, but there in the swamp or swale between 2 sand ridges we found them. They saw us first and ran, and as soon as we saw we had started them, we let the dogs go, and they started with a rush. And then the dogs, the game spy, an ill-bred and uneven pack, and such a wild, discordant cry, another fury on his back. Bishop. We could hear them yelp and yelp and yelp while they were on the tracks, and heard them when they came up to the bears, and then there was a wonderful confusion of voices. We could hear our dogs, and they seemed to be struggling hard for their lives. Bow wow, wow, bow wow, wow, yelp, 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 tee, tee, tee. When the dogs had got to the bears, we were about a half a mile from them. We hurried through the brush and over the logs as fast as possible to help our canine friends, as we supposed that they were in a life and death struggle. It was now my opinion that there never was such a noise and conflict in those woods before, nor since, at least heard by white men. When we were about half a mile to where the battle raged most furiously, it was all at once still. We could not hear a sound from them any more. We went a little farther and met old Watch and some of the other dogs crawling back. Watch, by his wounds, gave a good report of his courage. He was bleeding and had been wounded and torn badly. He was hurt the worst of any of the dogs. Before we reached the battleground, we met the last one. He was not hurt at all, and he had kept a proper distance. But they were all badly whipped and scared, and they had had enough of the bears. Sir Bruin to his forest flew, with heart as light as paws were fleet, nor further dare the curs pursue. It was a masterly retreat. Again, Bishop. When we got to the battleground, we could see where they had fought, clenched, and rolled over and over. The blood of the dogs was sprinkled all around on the snow, and we saw that it was the large bear which did the fighting. They would not leave the smaller ones, but fight for them. We saw in one place where the fight was the most severe, and one bear had attempted to climb a tree. He went up a piece on one side of it and down the other, and then jumped off before we got in sight and ran. We could see by the marks of the claws on the bark of the tree and on the tracks where he jumped off that he had climbed part way up. I've seen hundreds of times in the woods where bears had reached up as high as they could around little trees and scratched them. It showed the plainest on beech trees, as their bark was smooth. It is easy to see the size of the bear's paws and his length from the ground by these marks on the trees. That day, we saw where the bears had done some marking of the dogs as well as the trees. We found that the dogs had separated the bears, some having gone one way and some another. The grit has been taken out of us, as well as out of the dogs, and the bear hunt had lost its charm for us. We were a long ways from home, and we thought it best to get our wounded dogs and go back there again, if we could. We made up the chase and let those bears go. I felt the effects of the previous day's chase and tired out more easily. I wished I had let the Indian have the bears to do with what he had a mind with, and that I had never seen them. I presume there are now many persons in Wayne County who little think that 33 years ago, 1842, there could have been 4 wild bears followed in different towns of that country for 2 days, yet such was the case, and this was about the last of my hunting. My attention was being called to other business of more importance, which I thought it was necessary for me to attend to. So I hung up my rifle. I have not used it to hunt with in those woods a full 6 days since. That Indian who wanted the bears was the last Indian I ever saw in the woods hunting for a living. That Indian who wanted the bears was the last Indian I ever saw in the woods hunting for a living. I don't think there is a wild deer in the town of Dearborn at this day, and very few, if any, in Wayne County. I heard that there was one bear killed by a man near the mouth of the E-course last fall, 1874. He was a stranger and no doubt far from his native home. He was the first one I have heard of, seen in this country for years. A bear hunt in Michigan in 1842. I love the summing up there at the end, talking about what it was like, in his day when he was writing some of these memoirs in the 1870s, and how there are very, very few deer and obviously no bears. And it's probably very interesting that even Wayne County now probably has a lot more deer in it than it did in the 1870s. These wildlife, populations fluctuate so greatly. When I was a kid in this area in Indiana, deer were pretty scarce. It's like, oh, look, a deer. And it was kind of a rare thing. Just the other day, right here, just half a mile north of this cabin, there was a flock, as he would say it, of 25 deer in the field. Deer are just all over the place, as well as wild turkey that I don't know if they've ever been in this area before. So it's really interesting to see how much fluctuation there is. And even in his time, from when he was a young kid to later on in his life, how much it fluctuated then too. So great, fun stories about backwoods Michigan in the 1840s. I want to thank everyone for their amazing support here on Townsends Plus. What you do helps us do lots of different things on here, Townsends Plus, and other places. So thank you so much for your amazing support, and I hope you have a tremendous day. Thanks for watching.